Chapters 6 and 7. Mr. and Mrs. Squeers at home. Mr. Squeers, being safely landed, left Nicholas and the boys standing with the luggage in the road to amuse themselves by looking at the coach's exchanged horses, while he ran into the tavern and went through the leg-stretching process at the bar. After some minutes he returned with his legs thoroughly stretched. If the hue of his nose, brighter than ever, and a short hiccup afforded any criterion, and at the same time there came out of the yard a rusty pony chaise and a cart driven by 2 labouring men.
"Put the boys and the boxes into the cart," said Squeers, rubbing his hands, "and this young man and me will go in the chaise. Get in, Nickleby, get in."
Nicholas obeyed. Mr. Squeers, with some difficulty inducing the pony to obey him, they started off, leaving the cart load of infant misery to follow at leisure.
"Are you cold, Nicholas?"
inquired Squeers after they'd travelled some distance in silence. "Rather, sir, I must say."
"Well, I don't find fault with that," said Squeers. "It's a long journey in this weather."
Is it much further to do the boys' hall, sir?" asked Nicholas.
"About 3 mile from here," replied Squeers, "but you needn't call it a hall down here."
Nicholas coughed, as if he would like to know why.
"The fact is, it ain't a hall," observed Squeers dryly.
"Oh, indeed," said Nicholas, to whom this piece of intelligence brought much astonishment.
"No," replied Squeers, "we call it a hall when we're up in London, because it sounds better. But they don't know it by that name in these parts. A man may call his house an island if he likes. There's no Act of Parliament against it, I believe."
I believe not, sir," rejoined Nicholas. Squeers eyed his companion slyly at the conclusion of this little dialogue, and finding that he had grown thoughtful and appeared in no wise disposed to volunteer any observance, contented himself with lashing the pony until they reached their journey's end.
"Jump out!" said Squeers. "Hello there! Come and put this horse up. Be quick about you."
While the schoolmaster was uttering these and other impatient cries, Nicholas had time to observe that the school was a long, cold-looking house, 1 story high, with a few straggling outbuildings behind and a barn and stable adjoining. After the lapse of a minute or 2, the noise of somebody unlocking the yard gate was heard, and presently a tall, lean boy with a lantern in his hand issued forth.
"Is that you, Smike?"
cried Squeers.
"Yes, sir,"
replied the boy.
"Then why the devil didn't you come before?"
Please, sir, I fell asleep over the fire,"
answered Smike with humility.
"Fire? Fire? What fire? Where's there a fire?" demanded the schoolmaster sharply.
"Only in the kitchen, sir," replied the boy. "Missus said as I was sitting up I might go in there for a warm."
"Your missus is a fool," retorted Squeers. "You'd have been a good deal more wakeful in the cold, I'll engage."
By this time Mr. Squeers had dismounted, and after ordering the boy to see to the pony and to take care that he hadn't any more corn that night, he told Nicholas to wait at the front door a moment while he went round and let him in. A host of unpleasant misgivings, which had been crowding upon Nicholas during the whole journey, thronged into his mind with redoubled force when he was left alone. His great distance from home, and the impossibility of reaching it except on foot, should he ever be so anxious to return, presented itself to him in the most alarming colours. And as he looked up at the dreary house, the dark windows, and upon the wild country round, covered with snow, he felt a depression of heart and spirit which he had never experienced before.
"Now then,"
cried Squeers, poking his head in at the front door.
"Are you there, Nickleby?"
Here I am, sir," replied Nicholas.
"Come in then, come in," said Squeers. "That wind blows in at the front door fit to knock a man off his legs."
Nicholas sighed and hurried in. Mr. Squeers, having bolted the door to keep it shut, ushered him into a small parlour, scantily furnished with a few chairs, a yellow map against the wall, and a couple of tables, one of which bore some preparation for supper, while on the other a tutor's assistant, a Murray's grammar, half a dozen cards of terms, and a worn letter directed to Mr. Wackford Squeers, Esquire, were arranged in picturesque confusion. They had not been in this apartment a couple of moments when a female bounced into the room, and seizing Mr. Squeers by the throat, gave him 2 loud kisses, one close after the other, like a postman's knock. The lady, who was of a large, raw-boned figure, was about half a head taller than Mr. Squeers, and was dressed in a dimity night jacket with her hair in papers. She also had a dirty nightcap on, relieved by a yellow cotton handkerchief which was tied under her chin.
"And how's my Squeery?"
said this lady, in a playful manner and a very hoarse voice.
"Quite well, my love," replied Squeers. "How's the cows?" "Every one of them's all right," answered the lady. "And the pigs?" said Squeers. "As well as they were when you went away."
"Come, that's a blessing," said Squeers, pulling off his greatcoat.
"And the boys? Are they as well as they were, I suppose?" "Oh, yes, they're well enough," replied Mrs. Squeers, snappishly. "That young Pitcher's had a fever." "No," exclaimed Squeers. "Damn the boy, he's always on at something like that." "Never was such a boy, I do believe," said Mrs. Squeers. "Whatever he has, he's catching too. I say it's obstinacy, and nothing shall ever convince me otherwise. I'll beat it out of him if I could, and I will in 6 months' time."
"So you will, my love, so you will," rejoined Squeers. "We must have that done." Pending these little endearments, Nicholas had stood awkwardly enough in the middle of the room, not very well knowing whether he was expected to retire into the passage or to remain where he was. He was now relieved from his perplexity by Mr. Squeers.
"This is our new young man, my dear," said that gentleman.
"Oh!"
replied Mrs. Squeers, nodding her head at Nicholas and eyeing him coldly from top to toe.
"He'll take a meal with us tonight," said Squeers, "and go among the boys tomorrow morning. You can give him a shake down here tonight, can't you?" "We must manage it somehow, I suppose," replied the lady. "You don't mind much where you sleep, I suppose, sir?"
"No, indeed," replied Nicholas. "I am not particular."
"That's lucky,"
said Mrs. Squeers, and as the lady's humour was considered to lie chiefly in retort, Mr. Squeers laughed heartily, and seemed to expect that Nicholas should do so at the same time. After some further conversation between the master and mistress relative to the success of Mr. Squeers' trip, and the people who had paid and the people who had made default in payment, a young servant girl brought in a Yorkshire pie and some cold beef, which being set upon the table, the boy Smike appeared again with a jug of ale. Mr. Squeers was emptying his greatcoat pocket of letters to different boys and other small documents which he had brought down in them. Smike glanced with an anxious and timid expression at the papers, as if with a sickly hope that one might relate to him. The look was a very painful one, and it went to Nicholas's heart at once, for it told a long and very sad history. It induced him to consider the boy more attentively, and he was surprised to observe the extraordinary mixture of garments which formed his dress. Although he couldn't have been less than 18 or 19 years old and was tall for his age, he wore a skeleton suit such as usually put on very little boys, and which, though most absurdly short in the arms and legs, was quite enough, though most absurdly stretched across his attenuated frame. In order that the lower part of his legs might be in perfect keeping with this singular dress, he had very large boots on, originally made for tops, which might have been once worn by some stout farmer, but were now too patched and tattered even for a beggar. Heaven knows how long he had been there, but he still wore the same linen which he had first taken down, for round his neck was a tattered child's frill, only half conceived by a coarse man's handkerchief. He was lame, and as he feigned to be busy in arranging the table, glanced at the letters with a look so keen and yet so dispirited and hopeless that Nicholas could hardly bear to watch him.
"Are you bothering about something, Smike?" cried Mr. Squeers. "Let those things on the table alone, can't you?" "Oh, you're looking at them, are you?"
"Yes, sir,"
replied the youth, pressing his hands together as though to control by force the nervous wandering of his fingers. Is there?
"Well," said Squeers,
have you? Did anybody? Has nothing been heard about me?"
"Devil a bit,"
replied Mr. Squeers testily. The lad withdrew his eyes, and putting his hand to his face, moved to the door.
"Not a word," resumed Squeers, "and never will be. Now, this is a pretty sort of thing, isn't it, that you should have been left here all these years and no money paid after the first 6? It's a pretty sort of thing that I should have a great fellow like you to feed and never hope to get 1 penny for it."
The boy put his hand to his head, as if he were making an effort to recollect something, and then, looking vacantly at his questioner, gradually broke into a smile and limped away.
"I'll tell you what, Squeery,"
remarked his wife as the door closed,
"I think that young man is turning silly." "Well, I hope not," said the schoolmaster, "for he's a handy fellow out of doors, and worth his meat and drink anyway. I should have thought he had wit enough for us, whatever is happening to him. But come, let us have supper, for I'm hungry and tired and want to get to bed."
The reminder brought in an occasional steak for Mr. Squeers, who speedily proceeded to do it ample justice. Nicholas drew up his chair, but his appetite was effectually taken away.
"How's the steak, Squeery?" said Mrs. Squeers. "Tender as lamb," replied Squeers. Have a bit, my dear. Oh, I couldn't eat a morsel, replied his wife. What'll the young man take, my dear? Whatever he likes that's present, rejoined Squeers in a most unusual burst of generosity. What do you say, Mr. Knuckleboy? inquired Mrs. Squeers.
I'll take a little of the pie, if you please, replied Nicholas. A very little, for I'm not really hungry.
Well, it's a pity to cut into the pie if you're not hungry, isn't it? said Mrs. Squeers. Will you have a bit of beef?
Whatever you please, replied Nicholas abstractedly. It's all the same to me. Mrs. Squeers looked vastly gracious on receiving this reply, and nodding to Squeers, as much as to say that she was very glad to find that the young man knew his station, assisted Nicholas to a slice of meat with her own fair hands.
Ale, Squeery?
inquired the lady, winking and frowning, to give him to understand that the question propounded was whether Nicholas should have any ale, and not whether he, Squeers, would take any.
Certainly,
said Squeers, re-telegraphing in the same manner.
Give him a glassful.
So Nicholas had a glassful, and being occupied with his own reflections, drank it in happy innocence of all his foregone proceedings.
Uncommonly juicy steak, that,
said Squeers, as he laid down his knife and fork after plying it in silence for some time.
It's prime meat, rejoined his wife. I bought a good piece of it myself on purpose for what? exclaimed Squeers hastily. Not for the... No, not for them, rejoined Mrs. Squeers. On purpose for you when you came home. No, you don't think I could have made such a mistake as that? Upon my word, my dear, I don't know what you were going to say, said Squeers, who had turned pale. Oh, you needn't make yourself uncomfortable, remarked his wife, laughing heartily. To think that I shouldn't be such a noddy. Well...
This part of the conversation was rather unintelligible, but popular rumour in the neighbourhood asserted that Mr. Squeers, being amiably opposed to cruelty to animals, not unfrequently purchased, for consumption by the boys, the bodies of horned cattle who had died a natural death. Possibly he was apprehensive of having unintentionally devoured some choice morsel which was intended for the young gentleman. Supper being over and removed by a small servant girl with a hungry eye, Mrs. Squeers retired to lock up and also to take into safe custody the clothes of the 5 boys who had just arrived, and who were halfway up the troublesome flight to the steps which leads to death's door in consequence of exposure to the night. They were regaled with a light supper of porridge and stowed away side by side in a small bedstead to warm each other and dream of a substantial meal, with something hot after it, if their fancies set that way, which it is not at all impossible that they did. Mr. Squeers treated himself to a stiff tumbler of brandy and water, made on the liberal half and half principle, allowing for the dissolution of the sugar, and his amiable helpmeet mixed Nicholas the ghost of a small glassful of the same compound. This done, Mr. and Mrs. Squeers drew close up to the fire, and sitting with their feet on the fender, talked confidentially in whispers, while Nicholas, taking up the tutor's assistant, read the interesting legends in the miscellaneous questions, and all the figures into the bargain, with as much thought or consciousness of what he was doing as if he had been in a magnetic stupor At length Mr. Squeers yawned fearfully and exclaimed that it was time to go to bed. High time. Upon which signal Mrs. Squeers and the girl dragged in a small straw mattress into the room and a couple of blankets and arranged them into a couch for Nicholas.
"We'll put you here tonight and go to your regular bedroom tomorrow, Nickleby," said Squeers. "Let me see, who sleeps in Brooks' bed, my dear?" "In Brooks? Oh," said Mrs. Squeers, pondering. "Oh, there's Jennings, there's Little Boulder, there's Greymarsh, and what's his name?" "So there is," rejoined Squeers. "Yes, well, it looks as if Brooks is full."
Full, thought Nicholas. I should think he was.
"There's a place somewhere, I know there is," said Squeers, "but I can't at this moment call to mind where it is. However, we'll have that settled by tomorrow. Good night, Nickleby. 7 o'clock in the morning, mind."
"I shall be ready, sir," replied Nicholas. "Good night."
"I shall come in myself and show you where the well is," said Squeers. "Good night, Nickleby. 7 o'clock in the morning, mind."
"I shall be ready, sir," replied Nicholas. "Good night."
"I shall come in myself and show you where the well is," said Squeers. "You'll always find a little bit of soap in the kitchen window that belongs to you."
Nicholas opened his eyes, but not his mouth, and Squeers was going away when he turned back once more.
"I don't know, I'm sure," he said, "whose towel to put you on, but if you make shift with something tomorrow morning, Mrs. Squeers will arrange that in the course of the day. My dear, don't forget." "I'll take care of that," replied Mrs. Squeers, "and mind you take care, young man, to get and wash first. The teacher ought always to have it first, but they get the better of him if they can."
Mr. Squeers nudged Mrs. Squeers to bring away the brandy bottle, lest Nicholas should help himself in the night, and the lady having seized it with great precipitation, they retired together. Nicholas, being left alone, took half a dozen turns up and down the room in a condition of much agitation and excitement, but growing gradually calmer, set himself down in a chair, and mentally resolved that, come what might, he would endeavour for a time to bear whatever wretchedness might be in store for him, and that, remembering the helplessness of his mother and sister, he would give his uncle no plea for deserting them in their need. Good resolutions seldom fail of producing some good effect in the mind from which they spring. He grew less despondent, and so sanguine and buoyant his youth, even hoped that affairs in Dotheboys Hall might yet improve, at least a little. He was preparing for bed when something like renewed cheerfulness came upon him, and suddenly a sealed letter fell from his pocket. In the hurry of leaving London, it had escaped his attention, and it hadn't occurred to him since, but at once it brought back to mind the recollection of the mysterious behaviour of Newman Noggs. "Dear me," said Nicholas, looking at the letter, "what an extraordinary hand!" It was directed to himself, written upon very dirty paper, and in such cramped and crippled handwriting as to be almost illegible. After the great difficulty and much puzzling, he contrived to read it as follows.
My dear young man, I know the world. Your father did not, or he would not have done me a kindness when there was no hope of return. You do not, or you wouldn't be bound on such a journey. If ever you want a shelter in London, don't be angry at this, I once thought I never should. They know where I live at the sign of the Crown in Silver Street, Golden Square. It's the corner of Silver Street and James Street with a bar at the door both ways. You can come at night. Once. Nobody was ashamed. Never mind that, it's all over. Excuse, Harris, I should forget to wear a whole coat now. I have forgotten all my old ways, and my spelling may have gone with them. Newman Noggs. P.S. If you should go near Barnard Castle, there's a very good ale at the King's Head. Say you know me, and I'm sure they won't charge you for it. You may say Mr. Noggs there, for I was a gentleman then. I was, indeed.
It may be a very undignified circumstance to record, but after he folded this letter and placed it in his pocket-book, Nicholas Nickleby's eyes were dimmed with a moisture that might have been taken for tears.